At this point in society, almost everyone knows that smoking cigarettes and tobacco is bad for your health. That's pretty much an accepted thing, and people who smoke know those risks associated with it. Simultaneously, probably less, but still a lot of people know that getting secondhand tobacco smoke exposure is pretty bad as well, and that's basically when you're standing next to someone who is smoking actively and you're inhaling what they exhale. But how bad is it for your health? What are the negative outcomes and what are the long-term effects of that? Today's study looks at the long-term effects of secondhand tobacco smoke exposure, so let's take a look. What's up everyone, my name is Henrik and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm breaking down a clinical study looking at the long-term effects of secondhand tobacco smoke exposure on health. This study was published in April of 2019 by Dr. Eileen McNeely and others from Harvard University, their public health school. Okay, so we know that secondhand tobacco smoke exposure is bad, but how do we test how bad it is in humans? Well, it's pretty inhumane to force one group of people to undergo an intervention that we know is going to negatively hurt them. So today's study looked retrospectively at a group of people who historically were exposed to very high levels. Before 1988, smoking tobacco on airplanes was completely legal, and in a small space, the recirculating air with poor ventilation got pretty terrible, as you can imagine. Unfortunately, full-time flight attendants were exposed to tobacco levels or secondhand tobacco smoke levels equivalent to living with a pack-a-day smoker, and were exposed to amounts 6 times more than the average US worker and 13 times more than the average US citizen. Thankfully, bans began in 1988, stopping the dangerous levels of secondhand tobacco smoke exposure, but those flight attendants still had lingering problems that likely stayed with them. Today's study looks at the effects of secondhand tobacco smoke exposure on flight attendants nearly after 30 years of their primary exposure. So let's break it down. Looking at the study design, this was an observational clinical study, and all the subjects worked as flight attendants and were enrolled for the first wave of the Harvard Flight Attendant Health Study. Today's study was the second wave, looking at secondhand tobacco smoke exposure, or SHTS for short, as opposed to general health, as the first wave had analyzed. Data was collected in 2014 and 2015, and over 3,000 participants, measuring self-reported health outcomes like heart and breathing problems. They also measured employment history and lifestyle factors like age, BMI, and smoking status. Through employment history, researchers calculated the number of years of SHTS exposure based on how long flight attendants worked as flight attendants before 1988. To actually analyze the data, this study used a method called case-controlled sampling analysis. Basically, they matched each flight attendant who had SHTS exposure and compared them to a control, another flight attendant who had the exact same characteristics of age, BMI, race, and smoking status, but they simply didn't have the SHTS exposure. So that was the only difference between the two people. Here you can see Table 1 showing all the participants. Net tenure is the amount of time worked as a flight attendant, and net exposure is the time worked before 1988. They basically took someone from the exposed group and compared them to someone from the unexposed group, but they had similar backgrounds, so the only difference was the SHTS exposure. Therefore, they were able to run each person to a control and compare health outcomes, and they basically ran the simulation 1,000 times, matching new controls and getting data. In observational studies like today's, you really need to look at controls and keep other factors the same and constant, to only look at one variable so you can attribute outcomes to that one variable, like SHTS exposure today. Looking at the results, there was a 1.4 increase in odds of getting a myocardial infarction or heart attack if you had secondhand tobacco smoke exposure. There was also 1.3 times increase in odds of getting peripheral artery disease, which is basically atherosclerosis of the lower extremities or the narrowing of your arteries. And there was increased odds of getting repeated pneumonia, which is a pretty common but potentially dangerous infection of the lungs. There were also modest associations between secondhand tobacco smoke exposure with pneumothorax, which is air around the lungs, which can be dangerous, and transient ischemic attack, or TIA, which is effectively a mini stroke, where you basically start showing the signs and symptoms of a stroke, but it goes away pretty quickly, and it's typically a warning that a normal full-on stroke can happen. Simultaneously, there were no relations to asthma, bronchitis, sinusitis, or lung cancer, which is something you might not expect here. One limitation I'll note here in this section is that we could have biased results based on something known as the survivorship bias. Since all subjects here were recruited from a previous Harvard study, some of those people who had lung cancer before and those other breathing problems might have died, and we might not be able to include those people in our results, even though those people were flight attendants and even though they had secondhand tobacco smoke exposure and they had these problems. And so the main limitation is that because we're only looking at the survivors, quote unquote, the survivors, we might be biased and be missing the full picture. And that's just something that comes along with the study design, but still something important to note. So I don't know about you all, but I find this study really interesting because primarily it shows the long-term effects of secondhand tobacco smoke exposure even after the participants likely weren't exposed anymore. And like I said in my last video, these longitudinal studies are really awesome. Remember, bans of smoking on flights started in 1988 in the US, and the data was collected starting in 2014, almost a 30-year difference from when subjects were exposed the most to the secondhand tobacco smoke. So there were very likely some lingering effects. I also find it really sad that in most of the results where I got those 1.4, 1.3 times increased odds, everyone who had those problems really never smoked in their life at all. So because of their exposure through their job, they had to face the consequences of people smoking on flights. An important comment in this study is that they only looked at flight attendants, primarily because participants were already forced to get the secondhand tobacco smoke. So it's a pretty simple, easy to analyze. But you can definitely say flight attendants are more exposed to secondhand tobacco smoke than the average person. So you could say these results are on the more extreme side, but I would say they can still apply to someone who has less exposure. Especially imagine looking at the cardiovascular health outcomes of people who actually smoke instead of the people who are standing around them. Interestingly, this is not the first study to look at secondhand tobacco smoke exposure, as you can imagine, but it's definitely one of the larger ones, and the first to look at flight attendants, and the first to look at legacy effects over a long period of time. I'm not going to go into the specific details, but basically most of the results in this study are consistent with studies in the past, and I'll throw up a few studies here and in the description for reference if you're interested. But as I said already, today's study didn't find anything linked to lung cancer, asthma, or bronchitis, and I'm not sure why you might naturally expect that. Maybe it was the survivorship bias, but another reason that the researchers suggested is that their clinical study wasn't adequately powered. That's a statistical term. You can Google statistical power to find that out. But in this case, this means that the study needed a larger sample size to see that smaller relationship. Regardless, the obvious limitation, besides the survivorship bias, is that the average person probably doesn't have as much secondhand tobacco smoke exposure as flight attendants do. SHTS, or secondhand tobacco smoke exposure, in the study was also measured based on years, how long flight attendants worked before 1988. It could have been a lot more than that, it could have been a lot less than that, but that's basically a pretty rough measurement. But the main limitation is the incidence of when the health outcomes actually happened. Like when they happened wasn't actually measured. So someone could have had a heart attack in 2013 or 1990 and it would have been treated the same in the analysis. Therefore, it would be really interesting to see if most of the health outcomes happened later in the study as opposed to earlier. And that's something I would be curious to hear about. But regardless, I think it's a really cool paper that covers something that everyone could be impacted by. And now at least you know that flight attendants were really unlucky to be working as flight attendants when smoking was allowed on flights. Looking at a nice summary with some takeaways, an observational study with flight attendants studied the relationship between secondhand tobacco smoke exposure and health outcomes and found an increased risk of odds of getting a heart attack, peripheral artery disease, pneumothorax, repeated pneumonia, and transient ischemic attacks. Flight attendants probably had higher exposure to tobacco smoke than the average person, so the results are probably more extreme for the average person. However, a lot of people still smoke in the US, and although you might not smoke, you can still experience some of these problematic health outcomes if you're around people who are smoking. Simultaneously, this study collected data for nearly 30 years after the primary times of exposure, so it's very likely that effects lingered even after an extended break from that exposure. I've honestly heard and read so many things about how people say if you quit smoking by a certain point, your lungs will heal for the most part, and although that definitely can be true. What I find interesting is that even after stopping being around most of the exposure for these flight attendants, we still saw problems like in today's study. And here's evidence about what you do in the past can still affect you in some way. In short, secondhand tobacco smoke exposure increased the odds of having negative cardiovascular and respiratory problems. Basically, it's not the best thing to smoke, and don't be around people who are smoking for extended periods of time because the risks are serious. But regardless, that's all I had for today. I hope you guys learned something, and don't forget to like, comment, subscribe for more content, and keep watching these fun videos. But thank you for watching, and have a good one.